There's a photograph from 1972 that almost nobody talks about. Willie Nelson is standing backstage at a small Texas venue, not one of the famous ones, and he's got his arm around a man whose name history never recorded. The man is crying. Willie isn't looking at the camera. He's looking at the man. And according to the people who were there that night, Willie leaned in and said something quietly. Nobody heard exactly what it was. But whatever it was, Willie never stopped doing it. Stay with this story, because by the end, what that moment actually meant will completely reframe everything you thought you knew about Willie Nelson. Most people think they understand Willie Nelson. The red bandana, Trigger, his famous battered guitar, the outlaw image, the tax troubles, the weed, the endless touring. But that version of Willie is the surface. It's the version that sold magazines and filled arenas. The real story, the one that his closest collaborators have quietly referenced in interviews over the years, is about a promise. Not a public one. Not the kind that gets written into contracts or announced at press conferences. The kind that gets made in a dark corner of a venue, between a man who had everything and a man who had almost nothing. To understand what that promise was, you have to go back further than 1972. Willie Hugh Nelson was born in Abbott, Texas in 1933, a town so small it barely registered on state maps. He was raised by his grandparents after his parents separated. His grandmother taught him to read music before he could properly read words. By the time he was 10, he was already playing in local dance bands, absorbing the sound of a rural America that mainstream culture was actively trying to leave behind. Country music in those days wasn't a genre for outsiders. It was a genre about outsiders. Farmers, drifters, people who drank too much because life had handed them too little. Willie didn't just observe those people. He was those people. When he moved to Nashville in the early 1960s with a box of songs and almost no money, the industry saw him as a writer, not a performer. His voice was too unconventional. His phrasing was too loose. He didn't fit the polished Nashville sound that dominated the era. So he sold songs instead. Huge ones, actually. Crazy for Patsy Cline. Hello Walls for Fair and Young. He was making real money for the first time in his life, writing hits for other people while his own recording career quietly stalled. And here's what that period did to him, something that rarely gets discussed. According to people close to Willie from that era, the experience of being the invisible hand behind other people's success left a mark. Not bitterness, exactly. Something more complex. An acute awareness of who gets seen and who doesn't. Who gets the spotlight and who gets the session fee. He watched the music industry make stars out of songs he wrote while the people those songs were about, the drifters, the broke farmers, the quietly desperate, remained completely invisible. That awareness never left him. So when Nashville ultimately rejected him as a performer, when the suits decided his voice and his style were uncommercial, something interesting happened. Instead of conforming, he went back to Texas. And that decision wasn't just geographic. It was the beginning of a commitment. When Willie Nelson left Nashville and drove back to Texas in the early 1970s, the music industry wrote him off. Quietly, politely. The way institutions always dismiss people they've decided don't fit, not with a fight, but with silence. No more calls. No more meetings. Just the slow fade of a closing door. What they didn't understand was that Willie wasn't retreating. He was relocating his center of gravity to exactly where it had always belonged. Austin in 1972 was an unusual place. It sat at the intersection of two worlds that weren't supposed to mix, the traditional country crowd and the long-haired counterculture coming off the back of the 1960s. Cowboys and hippies sharing the same venues, the same beer, the same instinct that something real was happening outside the mainstream. Willie didn't create that collision, but he became its most visible symbol almost immediately. The 4th of July picnic, which Willie launched in 1973, is usually described as a music festival. That framing undersells it significantly. Think about what it actually was. An open field in Dripping Springs, Texas. Tens of thousands of people who didn't fully belong anywhere else. Veterans who came home from Vietnam to a country that didn't know how to look at them. Farmers watching their livelihoods slowly disappear into corporate agriculture. Young people disillusioned by a decade of promises that never materialized. And Willie Nelson on a stage, playing for all of them simultaneously, with no separation between the audience sections. No VIP barriers. No carefully managed brand experience. According to people who attended those early picnics, the atmosphere was unlike anything else happening in American music at the time. It wasn't a concert. It was closer to a gathering. The kind that happens when people who've been made to feel invisible finally find themselves standing next to each other in the same field, realizing they're not as alone as they thought. Willie understood something that the Nashville machine never grasped. The outsider isn't a demographic. It's not a marketing category or a radio format. It's a feeling, and it doesn't belong to any one type of person. The broke farmer and the disillusioned college kid and the Vietnam vet and the small-town woman who wanted something bigger than her zip code. They all knew that feeling. Willie's music didn't speak at those people. It spoke from inside the same experience they were living. That's what made Red-Headed Stranger, released in 1975, such a genuinely radical document. Columbia Records famously hated the album before it came out. It was spare, almost uncomfortably quiet in places. No orchestration, no production gloss. Just Willie, his band, and a story about a preacher on the run after killing his wife and the man she left him for. Dark material, unconventional structure. The label thought it was uncommercial to the point of being unbearable. It became one of the best-selling country albums of the decade. But here's what the commercial success obscured, what almost never gets mentioned in the standard Willie Nelson biography. According to interviews given by members of his band from that period, Willie was receiving letters, hundreds of them, from people across rural America who said the album had reached something in them that nothing else had touched. Not fan mail in the conventional sense. Something rawer than that. People writing about loss, about feeling abandoned by systems that were supposed to support them, about holding on. Willie read those letters. That detail matters more than it might seem. Because most artists at that level of success develop insulation, managers, assistants, layers of professional distance between the famous person and the people consuming their work. Willie actively resisted that insulation. People close to him from the 1970s onward have consistently described a man who remained almost unervingly accessible, who would stay after shows and talk to people long after the crew had packed up, who remembered faces and names in ways that seemed impossible given the sheer volume of people moving through his world. This wasn't performance. It wasn't strategic community building. It was something more personal than that. It connected directly back to what he'd understood since Abbott, Texas. Since watching his grandmother play piano in a small church for people who had nothing except the music and each other. Since selling songs to Nashville, while the people those songs described remained invisible to the industry profiting from them. He had built something, not deliberately, not according to a plan, but through consistent instinct over 2 decades. A body of work that functioned as a kind of Bible for people the mainstream had decided didn't matter. And with that came something he hadn't fully anticipated. Responsibility. The letters were proof of it. The faces after the shows were proof of it. And somewhere in that accumulation of quiet, unrecorded moments, a man crying backstage, a conversation nobody else heard, a promise made in the dark, Willie Nelson began to understand exactly what kind of artist he actually was. Not a star. Something older than that. Something that American culture used to have a word for, before the industry turned music into a product. What do you think that word is? If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own life, like the world was built for someone slightly different than you, you already know what Willie was becoming. And if this story is hitting differently than you expected, that's exactly why it needs to keep going. There's a specific kind of loneliness that doesn't show up in statistics. It's not the loneliness of being physically alone. It's the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling like you exist slightly outside the frame of everything happening around you. Like the world is a photograph and you're standing just beyond the edge of it. Rural America in the late 1970s and through the 1980s was full of people living inside that feeling, and almost nobody in positions of cultural power was paying attention. Willie Nelson was paying attention. By the late 1970s, something was happening across the American heartland that would eventually become one of the worst economic crises in agricultural history. Family farms, operations that had been passed down through generations, that represented not just livelihoods but entire identities, were beginning to collapse under the weight of debt, falling commodity prices, and federal policies that systematically favored large corporate agriculture over small family operations. Between 1979 and 1985, hundreds of thousands of family farms went under. Entire rural communities began to hollow out. Towns that had existed for a century started losing their grocery stores, their schools, their hospitals. The human cost was staggering and almost completely invisible to mainstream media. Suicide rates in farming communities rose sharply during this period. Mental health resources in rural areas were virtually non-existent. The cultural narrative around farming, the romantic image of the independent American farmer as a symbol of national strength, made it almost impossible for people inside that world to openly admit they were drowning. There was shame attached to failure that had nothing to do with the actual causes of that failure. Men and women who had worked their land with everything they had were losing it anyway, and the country that had mythologized them wasn't watching. Willie was watching. In 1985, he helped organize Farm Aid, a benefit concert that would go on to become one of the longest-running musician-led advocacy organizations in American history. The first concert was held at the University of Illinois in Champaign. 80,000 people attended. John Mellencamp, Neil Young, Bob Dylan, and dozens of others performed. But what separated Farm Aid from the other massive benefit concerts of that era, Live Aid had happened just 2 months earlier, was its specific, unglamorous focus. This wasn't about a distant crisis in another country. This was about the people driving on roads outside the venue, the families in the counties surrounding that stadium, the farmers who in some cases were actively losing their land while the concert was happening. According to accounts from people involved in the early organization of Farm Aid, Willie insisted on something that the other artists involved initially found unusual. He didn't want the event to feel like charity. He didn't want the farmers in the audience, and there were many, to feel like subjects of someone else's compassion. He wanted them to feel like the point. Like the reason the whole thing existed was not to generate sympathy for them from the outside, but to generate power from within their own communities. That distinction is subtle, but it's everything. Because charity creates distance. It positions the giver above the receiver. And Willie had spent his entire career collapsing exactly that kind of distance. Between performer and audience, between the famous and the forgotten, between the people the culture celebrated and the people it quietly ignored. Farm Aid wasn't a departure from his music. It was the logical extension of it. But here's what the history books tend to skip over. Farm Aid didn't fix the farm crisis. The structural economic forces driving family farm failures were larger than any concert could address. Federal policy didn't dramatically shift. Corporate agricultural consolidation continued. And Willie knew that. The people around him knew that. In interviews from the period, Willie spoke about Farm Aid not as a solution, but as a signal. Proof that the people being forgotten were worth showing up for. That someone with a platform and a choice about how to use it had decided to use it this way. What that signal meant to the people receiving it is harder to quantify than ticket sales or funds raised. There are documented accounts, collected over the years by journalists covering rural America during this period, of farmers who attended Farm Aid concerts or followed the organization's work, describing the experience in terms that go well beyond entertainment or even advocacy. People describing the moment of realizing that Willie Nelson had noticed them, that a man who could have spent that Sunday afternoon anywhere in the world had chosen to spend it making noise on their behalf. For people living inside the loneliness that doesn't show up in statistics, that kind of noticing can be the difference between continuing and not. Willie understood this because the music had already been doing it for years before Farm Aid existed. The letters from the 1970s had told him. The faces after the shows had told him. He understood that for a significant portion of his audience, his music wasn't recreation. It was infrastructure. It was the thing holding certain people together during periods when nothing else was. And that understanding, that specific, heavy, clarifying understanding of what his presence in people's lives actually meant, is what made the promise real. Not a burden. Not a performance of responsibility. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. Have you ever had a piece of music, a song, an album, an artist, that functioned as a lifeline during a specific period of your life? Not just something you enjoyed, but something you genuinely needed? If you have, you already understand what Willie was carrying. And if this channel has ever given you something worth holding on to, this is the moment to subscribe, because the next part of this story is where everything gets heavier and more real and more worth understanding. There's a particular kind of faithfulness that never makes headlines. It doesn't trend on social media. It doesn't generate press releases or award nominations. It doesn't fit neatly into the kind of narrative that publicists build careers around. It's the faithfulness of showing up, repeatedly, consistently, without fanfare, to the same people, in the same forgotten places, long after the world has moved on to something newer and louder and easier to monetize. Willie Nelson has been doing this for over 5 decades, and almost nobody in mainstream media has ever stopped to ask why. The touring schedule alone is almost incomprehensible when you look at it honestly. Willie Nelson, well into his 80s, was still performing over 100 shows a year. Not in the massive arenas that dominate the modern concert industry. Not in the carefully curated venues that generate the kind of ticket prices that turn music into a luxury product. Willie was playing state fairs, county rodeos, small amphitheaters in towns that the music industry stopped caring about 30 years ago. Venues where the parking lot contains more pickup trucks than any other vehicle. Venues where the audience contains people who save for months to afford the ticket. People close to Willie have described his relationship with touring in ways that consistently resist the standard rock star narrative. This wasn't about staying relevant. It wasn't about maintaining a brand or satisfying contractual obligations or feeding an ego that required the validation of a live audience. According to longtime members of his band and crew, people who have spent decades on the road with him, Willie's relationship with performing was closer to a calling than a career. Something he felt genuinely obligated to continue, not because of what it gave him, but because of what it gave the people in those seats. There's a specific account from a venue in a small Missouri town, reported by a journalist covering Willie's touring life in the mid-2000s, that captures something important. After a show that ended well past midnight, Willie stayed. The venue staff wanted to close. The crew was exhausted. Willie stayed anyway, standing near the stage door, talking to people who had waited. Not a meet and greet. Not a ticketed VIP experience. Just a man standing in a parking lot in Missouri, talking to people who needed to talk to someone. One woman told the journalist she had driven 4 hours to be there. Her husband had died the previous year. She said Willie's music had been the only thing that got her through the first 6 months.